and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Julie Doyle. Today we'll turn to foreign policy for one of our regular discussions. The political debate over asylum seekers has focused attention on the relationship with Indonesia. And Tony Abbott says he'll make Jakarta his first overseas visit if the coalition wins government. Well, joining me today we have Labor MP Michael Danby in Melbourne and Green Senator Lee Rhiannon in Sydney. But first, let's start with asylum seekers. And the multi-party reference group met with the Prime Minister's expert panel yesterday. Now, Lee Rhiannon, to you firstly, after the meeting, the Greens said that they wouldn't budge from their position of opposing offshore processing. Does that mean that the Greens will just ignore whatever recommendations this expert panel comes up with?
We're in there negotiating and putting some very clear proposals on the table that could bring a real solution here to save lives, to ensure that refugees are more quickly able to settle in Australia. And both Senators Christine Milne and Senator Sarah Hanson-Young are taking forward those plans that have got the backing from a large number of organisations and academics that work in this area. So we're very hopeful there will be a good outcome.
Is there any room for negotiation, though, if you're not going to move from that position?
Oh, there's clearly room for negotiation. I mean, let's remember that it was only a couple of decades ago under former Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser, Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke when we were able to quickly settle refugees coming from Indochina, tens of thousands of them, with a regional assessment. And we're looking at the possibilities of regional assessment, but not in the offshore processing form that both the Coalition and Labor have been intent on. And it's unfortunate that Labor rolled over and went with the Coalition on that policy.
Michael Danby, to you on this one, does it matter what recommendations the expert panel comes up with if the parties aren't prepared to move from their positions?
Well, first, Julie, I'm sorry, I've got to do this. I've got a threshold point I've got to make to you. I'm very uncomfortable appearing with Lee Rhiannon, who for 20 years was a member of the Stalinist Party of Australia and then transited to the Greens, and I think that's indicative of why the Greens have such a purist and extreme policy with regards to asylum seekers. While I was protesting for Soviet dissidents and opposing the abuse of psychiatry like the great Australian Professor of Psychiatry Sidney Bloch, Lee Rhiannon was working with the SPA party, according to her very close colleague of the time, Mark Ahrens. And I think that kind of political purism that has come into an ideological zealotry that's come into the Green political party is the reason why they work so hard with the Liberals to sabotage a compromise that was worked out by people even as widespread as Bob Katter in the House of Representatives. We don't want to see people drowning and impractical issues left up in the air for political purists like Lee Rhiannon and Sarah Hanson-Young to say that they're not going to have people settled offshore. I stood up in the Parliament, Julie, and I said I was wrong. I was wrong not to consider offshore processing. We have to do something practical to help these people who are seeking desperately to save their own lives. We've got to look after people who are in the refugee camps in Malaysia as well. And frankly, I've had enough of the Greens and the Liberals working together on this, and it's the last straw. I appeal to Green voters, a lot of whom are disaffected Labor voters, to send a signal to the Greens in Melbourne in that state by-election that's taking place, saying, we've had enough. Get off your high horses, abandon the purism and zealotry, and do something to help the poor people who are trying to come via boat to Australia.
All right, Lee Rhiannon, I better give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, look, Michael's still this Cold War warrior who is just so out of touch, and in many ways the rant that he has just given, which is highly insulting and very wrong, demonstrates the problems Labor has, because Michael knows that the Greens have been in there negotiating with Labor. 336 pieces of legislation have passed. We've been able to successfully move amendments to many of them that Labor accepted that improve legislation on a whole range of issues, from higher education, the mining tax, the carbon tax, and many measures that are needed in Australia. Labor and the Greens Politicians from both our parties are working together. Michael's rant about the political background is so out of touch. I've been in the Greens for 20 years. I've got the runs on the board in many areas that have brought benefits to the democratic process in terms of political donation for reform, to the environment, in winning extensions to national parks, public education, protecting public services. Meantime, Michael's colleagues in New South Wales and unfortunately in his own state have deserted those values. That's the problem that Labor is facing.
Well, let's move on from that one. And the former ambassador to Indonesia, John McCarthy, spoke on Lateline last night about the way that Indonesia would be viewing this political stalemate we have at the moment over asylum seekers. Let's hear what he had to say about this.
Absolutely, it's damaging our reputation. When Australians play politics all the time on this issue, when they can't resolve an issue which is a matter of course, protecting our borders, but also common humanity, when we go on year after year with this debate, it looks pretty pitiful for a wealthy, comfortable nation.
Michael Danby, to you firstly on that. John McCarthy was saying that he believes this political stalemate is causing damage throughout Southeast Asia and that Asians would be looking at this thinking that we're overplaying the issue. Do you think he's right?
Look, there's a few thousand people that arrived to fill our quota of 13,700 by boat. We don't want them risking their lives at sea. We don't want them drowning. Part of the process should be the humanitarian program of settlement or work in Malaysia that Chris Bowen negotiated with the Malaysian government. It is embarrassing for Australia that this relatively minor problem can't be solved. We got a compromise in the House of Representatives, and again I come back to the issue of purism and extremism. How can you say that I'm an out-of-touch cold warrior? I'm speaking up on behalf of the millions of people in Australia who are the sons and daughters or actual victims of communism themselves, from Vietnam, from Tibet, etc. These people have just as much humanity as Lee Rhiannon, and to say that their concerns are not my concerns or not the people of Australia's concerns is very unfair, and it just devalues genuine humanitarianism and concern for the refugees that are coming to Australia.
Well, let's try to keep the discussion focused on what we're talking about at the moment. And Senator Rhiannon, you heard those comments there from John McCarthy. Do you think he's making a valid point?
Oh, a very valid point. And Indonesia has been put in a very difficult situation because of the politicisation of the refugee issue in Australia. We have a responsibility under international law to assist and allow people to come to our country to seek asylum. Thousands of people are waiting in Indonesia, and in the 10 months up to April this year, we had only accepted 97 refugees from Indonesia, and that's why we have put forward, my colleagues Senator Sarah Hanson-Young and Christine Milne, part of the proposal is more money to the UNHCR so they can undertake their work in a more timely fashion to accept more refugees from Indonesia. Under the present scheme, 7% of our intake is on a humanitarian process. Under both the Keating government and the Howard government, the percentage was 18%. If Mr Danby was concerned about people and having their rights recognised and being allowed a safe journey to Australia, he would be putting pressure on his government to change their policy, which is barely different from the coalition.
Michael Danby, I wanted to ask you about some of the aid projects at the moment in Indonesia. We've seen the Foreign Minister Bob Carr in that country at the moment, and he's been talking about projects to make it easier for villagers to get jobs in tourism, more support for women and children, for example. Do you think the aid projects in Indonesia are being directed in the right way?
I've been in Aceh, Julie, and I've seen the value that Australian aid to Indonesian school children can be, with us building a primary school for $240,000 in those parts of the world. And isn't it better that Indonesian children are learning Bahasa, English and computer science rather than being fanaticised in some kind of madrasa? So I think the aid program to Indonesia, particularly in education, is fantastic. And the Indonesians have been very active with us in trying to disrupt the people smugglers' operations. There's nothing humanitarian, Senator Rhiannon, in people drowning at sea. And you know, you can hide from this as much as you like. The Greens can hide from this as much as you like. There is nothing humanitarian about not facing this issue and saying we were wrong. Offshore processing, just as in Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke's time, was part of the issue, and that has to be incorporated in the humanitarian and fair treatment of refugees in Australia, which, by the way, I was the author of the report from the Migration Committee, which the government took such great notice of, and I've been character assassinated by many people in the right in Australia for having done that. So fair treatment of refugees in Australia. A big tick to Indonesia for their assistance to Australia in aid and counter-terrorism and in assistance with disrupting people smuggling. But we need to face the issue. It's not the only way of handling it. We've got to do something else. And there are 80,000 refugees who are in a queue in Malaysia, Julian. They're the people who I'm concerned for as well, particularly the people who are at the head of the queue, who are even more desperate circumstances than some of the people who are trying to arrive here by boat.
Well, I'll bring Senator Rhiannon in there. What's your response there to what Michael Danby had to say?
Oh, look, this talk of queues is just meaningless. There's just tens of thousands of people, as he has identified, who have just given up any hope that there is a process that they will be able to engage with. And that's what's pushing them to take the boats and to take the risky journey. And that's why the Greens, in these negotiations, have put forward more money for the UNHCR, that we should be immediately taking refugees. Why don't you say that, Michael? You say you're worried about it. Agree with the Greens plan that we take an additional 4,000 from Malaysia immediately, an additional 1,000 from Indonesia immediately. Sorry, the 4,000 was from Malaysia, 1,000 from Indonesia.
Michael Danby, would that help, Michael Danby, if we were taking more refugees, more people who were waiting in Indonesia and thought they could see no way out except for getting on a boat?
Chris Bowen has foreshadowed that as part of a package where we're able to transfer some people back, where we get the Malaysians to treat all of the refugees in Malaysia humanely, that of course we would take more. We need a regional solution, as we had in Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke's time, but to not face the facts that there are some people who are in extreme circumstances in these refugee camps in Malaysia, who are in even more deserving circumstances than some of the people arriving by boat, is to just turn a blind eye to the whole situation. And we're condemning people to drowning at sea. And by the way, we have to sell this to the Australian people. The Greens can pontificate as much as they like. It costs $100 million per 1,000 people extra that we do. Now, of course, we should be generous and take more if we get this regional processing
and we'll have to bring it to an end there, Michael Danby. Thank you very much for that. Michael Danby in Melbourne and Lee Rhiannon in Sydney. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And you can join us for Capitol Hill again at the same time tomorrow.